Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Come Friday morning, I feel like we're getting a better sense of where this USC program wants to go in the spring transfer portal window. And I think it starts with, hey, y'all called it in the comment section. We talked about it over the last couple of days. I think we'd all be very surprised if we saw Chad Bowden and USC go out and throw a bunch of money around for a 6-month rental and make a big spring transfer portal window splash. I think that's clearly not in the cards for USC. And I think it starts with one. USC, I think, feels pretty dang good about where their roster sits going into 2025. And I think, secondly, and I think most importantly, Chad Bowden has a process and he has a vision for how he wants to build this roster at USC. And I'll tell you what that vision does not include, paying a guy like David Bailey $2 million to come in for 6 months into your program. One of the things that kind of is standing out as we get into some of the players that are setting up visits to USC, every single player that we're about to talk about has multiple years of eligibility remaining. And so you could maybe add some of these names and they can be depth pieces for you in 2025, but, could turn out to be starters somewhere down the road for USC. I don't think Chad Bowden's interested in just taking guys that are going to be in your program for 6 months. I think continuity is something that is kind of lost in this era of college football where so many programs are going to this, revolving door situation where they'll bring in a guy, he'll be there for 6 months, he'll transfer out of the program and go to the NFL. You look at all the best teams in the country, the teams that have been competing and winning national championships over the last couple of years, they all have one thing in common, and that is, hey, we're keeping our roster together for multiple years. And I think that's something that's very important to Chad Bowden. And as opposed to throwing, $2 million to a guy like David Bailey, who's going to be with your program for 6 months, make your team better in 2025, no doubt. Hey, we'd rather make sure we go get a guy like Tom and a couple other blue chip guys on the defensive line that are going to be with our program for 4 years. I'm a fan of the process. You're seeing USC stick to the process. And I think most importantly, the synergy is probably the synergy. That's probably the term I would use to describe it. It's there with USC. From the front office to the coaching staff, I think everybody's on the same page in terms of how we want to build this program up. I want to get into some names that'll be on campus that USC has kind of identified as some targets. I want to talk about a few more names that I think would be interesting targets for USC to pursue. Before we get into it, as always, the USC fans, appreciate you guys. It's been you all know I've had a blast talking this program for a very long time, but specifically since Chad Bowden has taken over this program, it's been a blast for me. And the amount of support the USC fans have shown the boys has been amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with what I think is a very intriguing name here. Rayshawn Pleasant, cornerback from Tulane. Went back and buzzed a little bit of his stuff from Tulane. One, the pure coverage ability, the length and movement skills, that combination, it's there. I mean, you go back to his year last year, had 37 targets faced at Tulane, started every single game for Tulane, only gave up 19 receptions, a 57% or 51% completion percentage when targeted. That's a dang good number for a boundary cornerback. But the thing that stands out to me the most, 8.7 yards per catch. This dude just doesn't give up big plays. And that's something that's very important when you're talking about a cornerback that's going to be playing out there on an island. So you have a cornerback that's going to limit the explosive plays from an opposing offense. Rayshawn Pleasant can do that. Now, do I think he comes in and immediately starts at the boundary cornerback position for USC? I'd probably say no, because I have some question marks about the physicality that he brings, especially when you're coming to the Big Ten. Not as good as I want to see in terms of supporting the run. Doesn't tackle in space as well. And you see some bigger wide receivers kind of have their way with him a little bit on the outside. Now, here's what's intriguing is he's a guy that you could trust to play a little bit for USC in 2025. He would come in and supply adequate experience and depth at the position in the 2025 year. Like, he's got 2 years of eligibility. And this is a guy that has power 4 attributes. So, hey, maybe he's a depth piece in the 2025 year. He could be a starter for this USC team in 2026. And then at the same time, he's elite in the kick return game. He took 2 to the house last year for Tulane, averages 35 yards per kick return, which, that number might not jump out immediately. That's basically an extra 10 yards of field position every time he's returning the kick. I mean, the ability to create game-changing plays at the special team position, as well as really helping your ability to just start with a little bit better field position every time he's returning kicks, that's an asset too. And so you're bringing him in as one depth piece in 2025, potential starter in 2026 with 2 years of eligibility, and a guy that can contribute on special teams. You talk about being efficient with how you want to use your resources. It's kind of you're getting your bang for your buck with a guy like Rayshawn Pleasant that can fill in and do a lot of different things for USC during his time if he comes to USC. And it sounds like he's going to be on campus this weekend. And it sounds like USC is probably the leader in the clubhouse here. Another name that I think we got to talk about is Gary Bryant. Now, we talked about Boise State linebacker Andrew Simpson. I think Gary Bryant seems to be the linebacker that USC wants to bring in. Now, going into spring practice, this was a position of concern from a depth standpoint. Hey, we y'all know how I feel about Eric Gentry. Y'all know how I feel about Desmond Stevens. Like, those are two linebackers that I like for USC. I think they'll be the starters going into 2025. Gary Bryant's not going to come in and start over either of them, I don't think. But he's a guy that, one, he's got 2 years of eligibility remaining, which is a common theme for these guys that Chad Bowden's going after. Number two, he provides that experience and depth. Now, pre-spring practice starting, I think USC probably would have taken 2 linebackers in the portal. With the emergence of Jaden Walker as a guy that USC seems to like a lot, I think they're only going to take one. And you look at Gary Bryant, the thing I love the most is he's not necessarily the kind of linebacker that USC's gone after over the last 12 months. USC's gone after a little bit more length, a little bit more hyper athleticism. But Gary Bryant's a guy that, hey, over 100 tackles at the FCS ranks last year, only missed 9% of his tackles, 28 run stops. This dude, he knows what he's doing on the football field. Like, you don't get 100 tackles out of luck. He knows how to pick through traffic, find the football. He ain't going to miss tackles when he has the opportunity to do so. This is a perfect fit for USC, especially as you talk about Eric Gentry last year with the program. Gary Bryant might be able to step up and start in 2026. A guy that's looking for a chance to play at the Power 4 level, a guy that USC seemingly would be a perfect fit for, a guy that has played a lot of football and can provide you that much needed depth that USC needs at the linebacker position, makes a ton of sense. And again, I'll go back to there's a process. There's a plan that USC is following in terms of how they want to operate in the spring portal window. I think Gary Bryant would make a lot of sense. Another name that it sounds like he is trending quickly to USC, and we might be breaking down a commitment at some point this weekend, Kennedy Urlacher. We've already talked about him, so I'll keep it short, but I did a little bit more work on him. He flashed as a freshman. Look, the sample size is not big. He was not a starter, did not play a ton of significant snaps for Notre Dame, but played a decent amount as a depth piece. As a true freshman, this dude knows how to find the football at the safety spot. Gives you a little position versatility too. Probably could play box safety, could play in the deeper third, could play nickel a little bit as well. 3 years of eligibility plus a redshirt year to use. This is a guy that, comes in and adds depth in 2025, but I would think would start for USC at some point during his career. You can tell that he's Brian Urlacher's son. Because, man, does he understand the sport of football. And it's hard to find safeties that know what they're doing at a high level. And I don't think Kennedy Urlacher is an all-time athlete at the safety position. But, man, does he know what he's doing. And that matters. Look at a guy like Kamari Ramsey. Kamari Ramsey is a solid athlete. I ain't getting at him for his athleticism. But what makes Kamari Ramsey that guy for USC is how well he understands the sport. I think Kennedy Urlacher, there's a lot of similarities in terms of football IQ that's going on there. And quite frankly, you go back to the high school film, you see all the same things. This dude knows what he's doing on the football field. That matters. And I think the most important aspect of this, Chad Bowden knows him. Chad Bowden was involved with him, recruiting him to Notre Dame. Chad Bowden was the sitting general manager watching Kennedy Urlacher play as a freshman. Having that extra information about how this kid is wired and how he goes about his business and what he brings as a person to this USC program important too, makes a lot of sense. And I will say one more thing. That kind of matters in the transfer portal. Like recruiting not just the player but the person, because that's difficult to do. The transfer portal recruiting process is hyper accelerated. You see these guys hit the portal and find a program inside of 2 weeks, inside a couple days in some instances. A lot of times it's hard to make sure they're a right fit for the program as a person. Chad Bowden knows Kennedy Urlacher and knows him as a person. I think that makes sense. Now, getting into a couple of players that have hit the portal that I think could be interesting. Bryce George, Ferris State offensive lineman that was connected to USC, commits to Iowa this morning. I am guessing USC wants to add one offensive lineman. And very similar to how we talked about the linebacker position, I think USC is pretty confident in their starting five with what we're hearing from Tobias Raymond at right tackle during spring. All right, well, we probably want to bring in a guy that has some years of eligibility remaining that can provide quality depth. Malik Agbo from the state of Washington, so he's a West Coast kid, hits the transfer portal this morning. Hasn't played a ton for Texas. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because he's been behind guys who are going to go in the top 50 of the NFL draft. Cam Williams, Calvin Banks, some of the guys they have on the inside. Him not playing and being a starter during his first 3 years at Texas is not a red flag in my opinion. And I think secondly, look, Texas has developed offensive linemen just about as good as anybody in the country. So 3 years within that Texas program, you're sitting there pretty damn confident that he's probably a pretty darn good offensive lineman. The thing I love the most, you got versatility. Can play tackle, can play guard. So he can come into your program, 2 years of eligibility remaining. He could be a backup guard. He could be a backup left or right tackle. He's played pretty much all over the offensive line during his time at Texas. Again, versatility, the depth, and the potential to be a starter in 2026. Like, it's all part of the plan for Chad Bowden. I think this one would make a lot of sense. How about Roderick Pleasant? And I know some USC fans probably it's a no-go. And look, I don't blame if you're a USC fan that says, hey, he had his chance to come to USC, did not take his chance. I get that side of things. It's a position where USC wants to add depth. This is a very talented football player that has 3 years of eligibility remaining. And I'll just start with this. Where USC was when Roderick Pleasant was coming out of high school, with the coaching staff that they had, can we necessarily blame Roderick Pleasant for not coming to USC? And I get that maybe the bridge is burned, but I think there's another element where it's like, hey, with where that defense and coaching staff was at in the 2022 and 2023 year, it's hard to blame Roderick Pleasant for not coming to USC. Maybe this is a guy you circle back to. And again, I understand if USC fans say, no thanks, but no thanks. But I think it's a guy that, 3 years of eligibility, could provide depth early in his time at USC and could eventually be a starting nickel cornerback who I think could, and I'll say this, I like him. I think he was a really good player coming out of high school, and I think Oregon liked him too after his freshman year. And it was just too much of a crowded room. We'll see where USC decides to go. Again, what fires me up is just it really seems like there's a process that USC is following. And that's just that it wasn't the case 12 months ago. We'll pause there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.